I'd like you to turn, if you would, to Mark chapter 16. You can stay seated for a few moments. Mark 16, and I want to look first at verse 8. Mark 16:8. I just want to point out to you before we begin the note that is probably in your Bibles. It's in the ESV, it's in the Pew Bible, it's in my ESV and in other translations that says something like, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16:9 through 20. What that means is that the earliest manuscripts that we have available to us, which date to about the 3rd century, that is the 200s AD, Mark's gospel ends with verse 8. But look at verse 8 and notice what it says. It says, "And they went out and fled from the tomb," that is the women, which we'll talk about later. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Seems like an odd way for Mark to end his gospel, doesn't it? It could be that Mark actually wrote all that we have right through verse 20, but most scholars believe that he probably didn't write the last 12 verses. And I'll talk more about that in our last sermon on Mark next week. But most scholars believe that those last 12 verses were added later by a well-meaning scribe, or perhaps more than one scribe, because there are potentially 2 additional endings to Mark's gospel, and I'll talk about that next week as well. But perhaps that they were added because the ending that they got was kind of unsatisfying. Like, we can't just end it there. There has to be more. And so that's perhaps one of the reasons why we have what we have. But the debate as to whether Mark wrote those last 12 verses or not, and how we come to have them, is still ongoing. But what I'd like to do is that this week, I'd like to deal with this passage as though the gospel ends in verse 8. And then next week, we'll deal with the longer ending, whether or not Mark wrote it. It still has important things to say to us. But if we look at verse 8, assuming that that's where the gospel ends, we still have to deal with the question, why is it that it ends as it does? And some have suggested that something happened that prevented Mark from finishing the gospel. The doorbell rang. There are all kinds of things that could have happened. Mark could have been imprisoned. There are all kinds of things. Or perhaps the actual ending could have gotten lost. That's another thought. But I personally tend, and you can draw your own conclusions about this, but I tend to agree with those who think that if the gospel ends at verse 8, then Mark intended to end it that way. And so that leaves the question, if so, why? Why would he bring his gospel to a close in such a strange and seemingly unfinished way? And we'll get to that question a little later, or perhaps a lot later, depending on how you look at your watch. For the present, though, I want to look at the larger narrative that Mark has given us that includes not only the resurrection of Jesus, which is our main focus for today, but also I want to look at what Mark says about the crucifixion. We, for the sake of, having manageable chunks, we tend to divide those passages up, and we tend to only preach about the resurrection at Easter. Have you realized that? It's kind of nice to be several months removed from Easter and have an opportunity again to reflect on the resurrection. So what I want to do is I'll have you stand, and I'd like for you to turn all the way back to, and stand if you're able, because we're going to read a lengthy passage, beginning all the way back in chapter 15 and verse 15. So if you can't make it all the way, feel free to sit down. But I want to read this thing as a whole, because I think it's important for what Mark is doing for us to hear it as a whole. We begin in verse 15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters. The Greek word there that'll be important later is called the praetorium. And they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which Mark translates for us, and that will be important later. Golgotha is an Aramaic word that means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each would take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, but put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, the mother of James, and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they had followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died and summoned the centurion. He asked him whether he was already dead, and when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. The Greek word there actually is more, can be translated, they were afraid or even terrified. And he said to them, "Do not be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee." I'm not going to say much about the fact that Peter is singled out here, but you can get an idea that grace is being extended to Peter, right? Peter, this is for you too, this news, in spite of your denial just a few days before. There you will see him just as he told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. You can be seated. Well, we've come to the end of Mark's gospel, and we have today and one more sermon before we wrap up our study. And one of the things that I want to do is to try to tie some important threads together that Mark has been working on as he's been working his way through the gospel. And one of the best ways for us to kind of get a big picture of what is this account about is to go back and remember the beginning. You may remember, I went back and looked at my notes, and I preached my first sermon on Mark all the way back in January of 2023. So we are living up to our reputation of moving fast. We've only been in Mark for a little over a year and a half. But then we looked at chapter 1 and verse 1. And we considered the evidence from early Christian tradition that Mark had been closely associated with Peter, and that his account is likely based on Peter's memories of his own time with Jesus and the events that took place. And it could be that Mark was the one who had fled when on the evening that Jesus was betrayed or was arrested. And so Mark had some memories of his own. But we also said that in all likelihood, Mark's intended audience was people living in the city of Rome, which is where Peter ministered in the final years of his life. And if Mark was ministering alongside Peter, then Mark would have been in Rome as well. And of course, we know from Christian tradition, which is more than just vague ideas, but good historical recounting, that Peter was martyred by Caesar Nero. And that's all of that, I think, that background is what makes the beginning of Mark's gospel so important and what he says at the beginning. And this is how he began the gospel. He said, the beginning of the gospel, and the Greek word there is euangelion, which we translate as gospel or the good news. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I pointed out way back then that those words seem to intentionally use the same language that we find in a proclamation that was made in 9 BC to honor the 54th birthday of Caesar Augustus. The proclamation declared Caesar's birth as the beginning of the gospel for the whole world. And it depicts Caesar as a god who had come to save the world and to usher in a season of peace and prosperity. So when Mark used the same words, he was subtly, or perhaps not so subtly, drawing a sharp contrast between the Roman practice of deifying their emperors, or the emperor's practice of deifying themselves, and his claim that Jesus, not the emperor, is the true euangelion, the true gospel, the good news for the whole world. And that it is Jesus and Jesus alone that the title Son of God belongs to. And as we've seen over these past months, Mark's entire gospel has been written to substantiate that claim. He wrote to testify to us that Jesus is the Son of God. So here at the end of his gospel, in this account of the crucifixion and the resurrection, one of the things that Mark is doing, and he's doing a number of things, and we've already seen some of that in the past few weeks about emphasizing the suffering and the mockery that Jesus endured. And another thing that he does is he uses the account reflects the fulfillment of many of the things that are in Psalm 22 that predicted from a Jewish perspective the suffering and death of Jesus. But another thing that I think Mark is doing here is he is tying us back to the beginning and drawing again another contrast between Jesus as the true King and Savior and the empty claims of the Roman emperors. As Mark's Roman audience would have read his gospel, they would have been familiar with a regal pageant called the Triumphal March. The Triumphal March actually originated in ancient Greece, and it celebrated the death and resurrection, mythological death and resurrection of the god Dionysus. And by the time you get to Roman times, the Roman emperors had adopted the triumphal march as a way of asserting their own divinity. And we know that both Caligula and Nero, who were emperors during the time that Mark would have been in Rome, used this practice in this ceremony. Basically, what the pageant did was it enacted the death and resurrection of the emperor, like I said, as proof that he was divine. And the details, and it's interesting how Mark points things out to us, and there are all kinds of details that Mark could have put in this account, but the details that Mark gives us in his account bear striking similarities to that triumphal march. And if you're interested, a scholar named Thomas Schmidt, who is a New Testament scholar, has written pretty extensively about those connections. And I want to share some of them with you so you can see the connections that Mark, I think, is intending his Roman audience to make. First, the march would begin in the Praetorium, which was the headquarters of the guard. And just as Mark begins it in the same place, right, in Mark's gospel, Jesus is first taken to the Praetorium, to the headquarters of the guard. And the entire guard would be assembled for the occasion, and they would dress the emperor in a purple robe and place a crown on his head, and they would declare to him their loyalty. Some even believe that they would use those same words, "Hail King Caesar, hail King Caesar." And so Mark in chapter 15, verses 16 through 19, describes a very similar scene as the whole battalion of soldiers is gathered at the Praetorium in Jerusalem, and they clothed him in a purple robe, and they put a crown of thorns on his head, and they mockingly hailed him as King of the Jews. After that kind of assembly time, the procession would make its way from the Praetorium down the Via Sacra in Rome. And the emperor, as they went on the road, the emperor would walk alongside a bull. And the bull was there to become the sacrifice. The bull was also clothed in a purple robe and had a crown on its head because the bull was intended to represent the emperor. And marching alongside the bull would be someone who had been designated to carry the instrument of death, which was a double-bladed axe. And so just like that in Mark's account, Jesus himself is the sacrificial victim. And Mark tells us in 15:21 that an individual was chosen to walk beside him, Simon of Cyrene, who, like in the triumphal march, Simon was given the job of carrying the instrument of death, the crossbeam of the cross. The triumphal march would lead to the temple of Jupiter in Rome, which was located on a hill called the Capitoline. And that word means place of the head. So Mark tells us in 15:22 that Jesus was led to Golgotha, which means, and Mark, you'll notice Mark is careful to translate it for us so that his Roman-speaking audience would understand the Aramaic word. It means place of the skull. In the Roman pageant, as the bull was being sacrificed, the emperor would be offered a cup of wine mixed with myrrh, but he would refuse it. And then the wine would be poured out on the sacrificial altar to represent the shedding of the emperor's blood. Likewise, Mark says in 15:23 that Jesus was also offered wine mixed with myrrh, and he too refused it. But unlike the emperor, whose blood was only symbolically shed, Jesus' blood was actually poured out as a sacrifice. After the sacrifice, the emperor would show himself as if he had risen from the dead. And then, after the emperor came forth and all the people saw him, a Roman official, usually a commander of the guard would declare the emperor to be a god. And so, Mark tells us in verse 39 that as Jesus died, it was a Roman centurion who declared, "Truly this man is the Son of God." I would suggest that those similarities are too many to be a coincidence. That Mark intends, and you can tell how he has pointed certain things out. It seems pretty clear that Mark is here saying the same thing he said at the very beginning of his gospel. That it is Jesus, not the emperors, who truly is God. The triumphal procession was just a pageant. It was nothing more than an enacted fantasy. The emperor didn't actually die, and therefore he didn't actually rise from the dead. So despite all the pomp and circumstance and all the theatrics, the emperor was only a man. In fact, it seems to me that the whole pageant kind of proves that out, right? The emperor relied on a bull as a stand-in for him so that he didn't have to die. Jesus, on the other hand, didn't have a bull as a stand-in. He is the one who was sacrificed. It was his actual blood, not a cup of wine, that was poured out. And Mark is careful to tell us in 15 verses 33 through 42 that he actually died and he was buried in an actual tomb. And an actual stone, and Mark points out a very large stone, was rolled across the entrance. And there he lay, actually dead, until the third day. So what Mark, I think, wants us to understand, one of the layers of what Mark is communicating to us, is that as we read the account of Jesus' suffering, as he endured what appeared to be a shameful death of agony and defeat, the journey to the cross was actually a triumphal procession. A procession of triumph by which Jesus has proved that he was and is the true King, the eternal Son of God. And by his actual death, he has triumphed over the prince of this world, and he has broken the chains of sin and guilt forever. And by his actual resurrection, he has triumphed over death itself, so that all who believe in him and acknowledge Jesus, not the emperor or any other earthly power, but Jesus, who acknowledge him as their only and true King, can also be set free from death itself. By his actual death and actual resurrection, he has demonstrated that he is the euangelion. He is the gospel. He is the good news that changes everything for everyone, forever. The emperors declared themselves as gods who had been sent to save the world, but there is only one who can claim that title. There is only one Savior, and that is Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. Didn't the songs we sang today sing that thing? So it was, Mark tells us in chapter 16 and verse 1, that very early on Sunday morning, after the sun had risen, the sun rose to mark the beginning, at least for conventional way of thinking of the third day. The same three women who had stood at the foot of the cross until the very end, who had followed his corpse all the way to the tomb and had seen for themselves the massive stone rolled into place, gathered again, hoping somehow to gain access to his body so that they could finish the process of embalming that had been cut short on Friday because the sun was setting and the Sabbath was beginning. They wondered, Mark says, as they went to the tomb, how that large stone could possibly be rolled away so that they could have access to Jesus' dead body. You see what Mark wants us to see here? These women weren't going to the tomb saying, I wonder if he's risen. They had no expectation whatsoever that Jesus' dead body wouldn't be behind that stone in the tomb. But Mark says in verses 4 and 5, as they arrived at the tomb, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. And what's more, instead of a dead body, they found someone very much alive, seated next to where they themselves had seen Jesus' corpse laid just a couple days before. And Mark tells us they were terrified. The angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised." Again, that your ESV says he has risen, but actually the Greek reads he has been raised, which emphasizes the hand of God affirming Jesus as his son and affirming everything that Jesus had done. God raised him from the dead as a testimony as a vindication of who Jesus was and what he claimed to be and do. He is not here, the angel said. See? Look where they laid him. It's empty. Again, Mark wants us to take note from the words of the angel that Jesus was actually dead. The angel says he was crucified. Mark wants us to remember that ceremony. The emperor wasn't actually dead. Jesus actually died. And those words also communicate the gravity and the wonder of the angel's next words. He has been raised. He is not here. This is no symbolic death and resurrection. The message of the angel is clear. Jesus had indeed died, and now he is alive. He then gave them instructions to go and tell the disciples that he would meet them in Galilee. And as we know from the other gospel accounts, the actual risen Jesus did meet them, first in the upper room later that day, and then in Galilee. And he also, in the 40 days before he ascended into heaven, appeared to many, many other people. Paul tells us as many as 500 at one time, who saw for themselves the risen Christ. But if verse 8 is where Mark intended to end his gospel, he doesn't tell us that. Instead, he tells us that the women went out and fled from the tomb because they were filled with trembling and astonishment. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And we know that it must be that eventually they did get their wits back, and they went and reported what had happened. But Mark doesn't tell us that. What a strange, abrupt way for his gospel to end. You can see why people have had a difficult time accepting that ending and have wanted to fix it up a little bit. But if he did intend it, why would he end it in that way? Well, for one thing, we've seen throughout Mark's gospel that he is not a person to wax eloquent. It's taken us a year and a half to get through it, but he moved through it pretty quick. So it shouldn't really surprise us that Mark would be as brief here as he has been through his entire gospel. And when you think about it, the response of the women should also not be surprising. What should we expect them to do or to say after having had an experience like that? I think Mark wants us to grasp that they had just been confronted with a reality that was completely outside of their experience. And just as you recall some of those scenes in Mark's gospel, remember the Gerasenes were terrified when Jesus cast Legion out and sent him into the pigs, and they ran off the cliff. The text says they were terrified. And the disciples were terrified after Jesus had calmed the storm. And Peter and James and John had been terrified when they had seen Jesus transfigured on the mountain. All of that reminds me of that scene in Isaiah chapter 6 where Isaiah sees the glory of God in the temple, and confronted with the holiness of God, he says, "Oh, hi God, how are you?" No, he is terrified. So these women receiving this angelic announcement of his resurrection come to realize that there is something wholly other at work here. This is the living God. And we sang about his holiness. His holiness is not a trivial thing. So they were seized with fear, and they ran away. The end. I also think that Mark has intentionally left his gospel open-ended to allow his readers to fill in the rest of the story for themselves. His purpose is not just to give us an account of Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection, but he intends that we should ask the same question here that he has compelled us to ask throughout his gospel. Who is this man? What will you do with Jesus? Mark has made his case that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that he is the Evangelion, the good news that salvation has come. But the announcement of the good news is more than just a newspaper headline. It is, by its very nature, a very personal thing that requires a very personal response. What will you do with Jesus? We too have heard Mark's testimony in support of his claim that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And like the women at the tomb, we have heard the announcement that he has been raised from the dead, though we also have not yet seen it for ourselves. Mark has taken us as far as he can take us, without intruding on our own individual responsibility of faith. And now the ball is in our court. What will we do with Jesus? Will we believe the testimony of the angel that Jesus has indeed been risen, and therefore all the claims that he made about himself are true? Or will we persist in our unbelief, relying on our own understanding, rather than putting our trust in the one who died and rose again to break the power of sin and defeat death, and therefore what we're left with is empty emperors. He and he alone can offer us redemption and life. We've been studying today in John 16, and Jesus saying to the disciples that in a little while you're not going to see me, referring to his death, but in a little while you will see me. And when you see me, you will have a joy that no one can take away. Can you imagine what it must have been like for them? No one could convince them they hadn't seen what they had seen. And no one could level any kind of threat against them that would possibly mean anything to them, because they had seen the author of life raised from the dead. They had an anchor that changed everything about how they thought, about how they lived, about the choices that they made, about what they were afraid of and not afraid of. We have that same anchor. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed, and that changes everything. May we live in the joy of that truth. May we respond to the question that Mark leaves us with: who is this man? May we respond, he is the Christ, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. That changes everything for everyone forever. Amen. As the worship team comes, let me close with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for how you and your sovereignty have worked out your plan that ties in all these threads, that your people, inspired by your Spirit as they wrote these words down, were able to make those connections to help us to see. And that you have given us the ability, Father, to look into your word and see its truth as it rings out, and then to hear its challenge for us. Will we live in the truth that Jesus is risen from the dead? Help us, Father. Encourage us by these words. Fill us with your joy and hope. In Jesus' name, amen.